I'm just allowing 2 minutes for people who had to relieve their bladders on the way back from the film. It was a long film. And while we're waiting for them, I might say that I shall resist talking all this hour about the film, which is about the 3rd or 4th time I've seen it. What an amazing film. And what particularly struck me, of course, was that the book is 79 pages long in my edition. And that film went on and on and on. I mean, delightfully, but I felt that there was so much in it that Visconti had had no choice. You know, that it was, you know. So, shall we start? Yes. And can you hear me? Yes, good. Just a point just before we start, for those of you who saw the film, of course, he's omitted, Visconti, the beginning of the story, which is only really a lead in to that central passion of the book. And he's also he's spelled out the main, I think, the main conflict of the book, which is between the Apollonian vision of art, art as a controlled, ordered thing, and the Dionysiac, where wildness and confusion and almost a sort of degradation is the way to art. And that was spelled out in the film by the young musician, wasn't it, for those of you who were there. I thought it was very clever of him because, of course, words on the page are not possible in the film, and a lot of it was done visually. And the other thing that's interesting about a film being shown instead of reading the book is that in the book it's far more ambiguous. Did he really turn round and look at at Aschenbach? Did he really do all that? Or did he imagine that he did it? Yes. And it was very interesting because in the film, of course, you have to make a choice. You have to make the young actor turn round and look suggestively back, don't you? But in the book, of course, because it's the point of view quite often of the aging writer von Aschenbach, Gustav von Aschenbach, one can sort of leave it open and see this as a sign of his growing infatuation with the young boy. Okay, I think we shall start. I mean, you know, there may be 1 or 2 people who get here a little bit late. I was very pleased to see how popular the film was. I imagine we could have filled this theatre with them. Well, no course on love literature is complete without reference to Shakespeare's sonnets, and my original impulse had been to start each of the lectures with a Shakespeare sonnet, but there are so many other wonderful things as well. In particular, I think this week I find sonnet 129, which is not one of his best known, perhaps, certainly not one of his most reassuring, but perhaps one of his most psychologically acute sonnets. The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lost in action. Until action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame. Savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated, as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad, mad in pursuit and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof, and proud and very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. Such a good poem. Could have applied to yesterday, of course, but it's not so much lust, it's desire, isn't it? And that film, I'm sorry to go back to the film, we shouldn't have seen the film before, we should have seen it afterwards. Death in Venice, then, takes a quite different angle on love from the book that we were reading yesterday, The Age of Innocence. Published in 1912, it was actually published 8 years before The Age of Innocence, when homosexual love was not only frowned upon, but actually illegal, as you know. It was all the less acceptable when, in this case, the young man was about 14. We'll talk about that in a minute, probably younger, actually. Death in Venice, and 14 was the age of consent in Germany, so it was very carefully chosen, that phrase, about 14. Because it's one thing homosexuality, it's quite another thing pederasty, isn't it? Death in Venice became on publication a classic of homosexual passion, which yet made enough show of moral judgment not to seem a direct plea or cause a public scandal, and which has been made into both a film, as you've just seen, and an opera by Benjamin Britten, with a prestige of their own. As the critic T.R. Reid argues in Man and History, it has probably done more to edge homosexuality into the common culture than any other single work of art. Well, that perhaps it was so. I'm not sure that it would be so in 2017 because we've had so many more books about homosexuality, but it was a daring thing to do in his day. The narrator, the remark of man's old enemy, Alfred Kerr, that it made pederasty acceptable to the cultivated middle class was meant to be sarcastic, but actually it turned out to be prophetic. Mann himself states in a letter of 1920 to a poet who was known to be gay, Carl Maria Weber, that Death in Venice at once sublimates, and I think there is a certain amount of sublimation in the feeling he has for the boy, and pathologizes forbidden love. So it's a very ambivalent sort of take on this passion. Mann himself described it as a moral fable, but I can't help feeling that he was a little bit sort of ambivalent about where he stood on what should have been the end of the story. Besides being seen as a homoerotic master text, however, Death in Venice has also been interpreted in a number of different ways, as a cryptic parable of art, that conflict between the Apollonian and the Dionysiac that I was talking about, a modern interpretation of classical myth, and there are many, many references to myth throughout, as you'll see, and a study in arrogance and self-deception, or perhaps, for the biographer that I am, largely a piece of autobiography. One point at which most critics would agree is that Death in Venice belongs to that small group of books which punch above their weight. I'm sure you can think of others. Heart of Darkness, Conrad, Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, James's The Turn of the Screw, and Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground were the ones that I chose as examples. Books which seem to say more than they can possibly say in such a short length. I mean, they are novellas, they're not novels. Published in 1912, as you know, Death in Venice follows the seemingly mundane summer holiday, at least to begin with, of Gustav von Aschenbach, who's an aging German writer, not a musician, for those of you who've seen the film. He's a writer. Recently ennobled, and he's suddenly seized with a passion to travel further than his usual summer house in the Austrian Alps. And he decides on impulse to go to the Adriatic, which is not too far away, and to go to a little island called Pula, P-U-L-A. Quickly tires of it and goes on to Venice. And there's a wonderful quote at this point. But of course, when one wanted to arrive overnight at the incomparable, the fabulous, the like nothing else in the world, where was it one went? Why, obviously, and he doesn't even tell you where it is, Venice. He had intended to go there. Whatever was he doing? So he up sticks and leaves Pula after a couple of days. Later on in the story, you'll note, if you're Venice watchers, when Aschenbach himself has been shaken out of his usual calm, Apollonian attitude towards art, Venice becomes that fair frailty, that fawned, that betrayed, half fairy tale, half snare. And Aschenbach felt his senses wooed by this voluptuousness of sight and sound, tasted his secret knowledge that the city sickened and hid its sickness for love of gain, which is, of course, literally what happens in the book, isn't it? The cholera strikes, the people in the hotels will not tell the tourists that it's come, and so the city sickens and many, many people die. Let me give you... So, over the weeks he spends in Venice, Aschenbach develops an infatuation with a young Polish count, Tadzio, on holiday with his family at the same hotel, eventually following him round obsessively. That's where the cinema triumphs over the book, isn't it? When cholera breaks out in the city, he's unable to leave and is found dead on the beach at the end. And that reference to it being a moral tale is very difficult to square with what Aschenbach decides not to do in the book. And it's done in the film by him thinking he's going to tell the Polish family about cholera, warn them to leave, and his own self-interest, which is that the boys should not leave. And his self-interest wins. How you can call that a moral tale, don't ask me. Published quite near the beginning of Mann's writing career, when Mann was 36, Death in Venice was based on a real incident in his own life, the year before the book was published in 1911. As his wife, Katya, relates, all the details of the story, she tells us, beginning with the man in the cemetery, whom I'll introduce those of you who are only film knowledgeable to in a minute, beginning with the man at the cemetery are taken from experience. In the dining room, on the very first day, we saw the Polish family, which looked exactly the way my husband described them. The girls were dressed rather stiffly and severely, and the very charming, beautiful boy of about 13 was wearing a sailor suit with an open collar and very pretty lacings. He caught my husband's attention immediately. Now, this is the real Tadzio. This is the original Tadzio in the hotel. Tadzio Mose, his name was. As one of my students said, she said, well, he looks a bit plump, doesn't he, by comparison with that wonderful boy in the film. Such is the disastrous effect of films. But this is the young Polish count, and he's been written about. The real Tadzio was published as a book, and it was by Gilbert Adair in 2001. So he was born in 1900, so in fact he was 10 when Mann first saw him. I told you I thought 14 was pushing it a bit. He caught my husband's attention immediately. This man, not the other man. The boy was tremendously attractive, and my husband was always watching him with his companions on the beach. There he is with his companions on the beach. And Tadzio's real-life friend, whom you see, of course, represented in the film, Jas Fudakovsky, I'm probably mispronouncing, Jas is on the right. So it's nice to have the evidence that this actually happened to him, and his artist's imagination turned it into a story. Well, Death in Venice is a brilliant artistic feat, and I have to say the same as I would have said about Edith Wharton yesterday, not a spare word. And of course, in this case, because it's 79 pages long, you can imagine it would have to have not a spare word, wouldn't it, to be effective. Mann creates a sense of foreboding and menace from the very first paragraph, from the from the title onwards, Death in Venice. the action drives forward relentlessly from one sense of menace to another, unveiling a shifting scene of brooding and grotesqueness. There are grotesqueries everywhere you look. There are beggars dying of cholera in the streets. There are these figures we'll talk about in the minute whom he keeps encountering on his journey, all with red hair. So anybody's got red hair, hide it. And there is, as I say, this starts in the very first paragraph, extract 2. Gustav Aschenbach. Now the year, before we start reading this paragraph, the year is 1911. The book is published in 1912. What is going to happen? It wasn't just in 1914 that we knew war was on the way. By 1911, the threat of German dominance was, and their desire for trade and for dominance was building up. And it was very, very difficult to ignore the sense that something was building up, something was about to explode in Europe. So, as he had been known officially since his 50th birthday, he'd set out alone from his house in Prince Regent Street, Munich, for an extended walk. It was a spring afternoon in that year of grace, 19 blank, and of course we know it's either 1911 or 1912, when Europe sat upon the anxious seat beneath a menace that hung over its head for months. Aschenbach had sought the open soon after tea. He was overwrought by a morning of hard, nerve-taxing work which had not ceased to exact his uttermost in the way of sustained concentration, conscientiousness, and tact. Sounds a bit dull, doesn't it, really? And so we get to the introduction, not just of the menace, but of this idea that he's an artist who is tightly in control. There's no kind of inspiration like Wagner or something. I mean, there's nothing like that. It's a kind of tight grip on control, on form, on shape. This sense of unease is increased when he decides to take a walk. And he decides to take a walk to the cemetery, a decision which reinforces a theme present from the title onwards, that of death. It begins in a cemetery and it ends with the threat of a cemetery when he dies. By the end of the book, when he is himself dead against a wholesale death in Venice, people are dying like flies, this title will seem fully justified. For as Mann puts it, quote, death unseen and unacknowledged was devouring and laying waste in the narrow streets. That's about 3/4 of the way through the book. And there are, even before this, other ominous references to death, particularly in Aschenbach's gondola ride between Venice and the Lido, where the gondolas themselves become coffin-like structures, which are mentioned actually in those terms in the text, black as death. This awful sense of being pushed out into an unknown place. And you're taking me somewhere I don't know. He's out of control, of course. And it's been compared afterwards, after people read it, and read it in terms of the classical mythology he was talking about. It's been read in terms of Charon rowing the departing souls across the river Styx to Hades. But back to that first walk to the cemetery. He found the neighbourhood, this is extract 3, quite empty, not a wagon in sight, either on the paved Ungerstrasse with its gleaming tram line stretching off towards Schwabing, nor on the Föhring highway. Nothing stirred. Behind the hedge in the stonemason's yard, where crosses, monuments, and commemorative tables made a supernumerary and untenanted graveyard opposite the real one. So you already have this, this predominant imagery of death. He's brought back to reality, as the text tells us, by the sight in this eerily empty place of a man standing in the portico above the two apocalyptic beasts that guard the entrance. And something not quite usual in this man's appearance gave his thoughts a fresh turn. That's man talking. And this is an introduction to a series of figures whom one critic, I think, has called very cleverly disfigured figures. There's something distorted, and I mean, those of you who saw the film will remember the street musician particularly. Something threatening, something grotesque, something death-like almost about these figures. Extract 4. Whether he had come out of the hall through the bronze doors or mounted unnoticed from outside, it was impossible to tell. This man was of medium height, thin, beardless, and strikingly snub-nosed. He belonged to the red-haired type and possessed its milky, freckled skin. He was obviously not Bavarian, and the broad, straight-brimmed hat he had on even made him look distinctly exotic. And so it goes on. He stood there, this is halfway down, sharply peering up into space out of colourless, red-lashed eyes, while two pronounced perpendicular furrows showed on his forehead, in curious contrast to his little turned-up nose. And this is the bit I found particularly nasty and suggestive. Perhaps his heightened and heightening position helped out the impression Aschenbach received. At any rate, standing there as though at survey, the man had a bold and domineering, even ruthless air, and his lips completed the picture by seeming to curl back, either by reason of some deformity or else because he grimaced, being blinded by the sun in his face. They laid bare the long, white, glistening teeth to the gums. I think to say that Aschenbach felt an unpleasant twinge is probably understating the case. This man, then, is the first of these disfigured figures. Possibly, and a lot of critics have gone to town on this, as you can imagine, possibly he is a sort of a projection of what Freud would have called repressed desires. There is this man, he's suggestive, he's leering, there's something that he's almost beckoning Aschenbach towards. Because, as Richie Robinson, another very good critic of man, says, man is in the situation of many people approaching middle age. He's approaching what we call a midlife crisis. People who've channeled their energies into one channel and then in midlife are left with very little else. Such a person's ripe for the midlife crisis, well described by Jung, in which buried aspects of their self make their presence felt through significant dreams. And true to form, a dream follows, a terrible dream, a dream of orgy, a dream of lush, tropical, and again, highly suggestive, plants of crass vegetation, fat, swollen, thick, with incredible bloom. This is extract 5. There were trees misshapen as a dream that dropped their naked roots straight through the air into the ground or into the water that was stagnant and shadowy and glassy green. And so it goes on. And this is a sort of daytime hallucination which comes to accompany the dreams that he has at night. It's a journey then, his journey, the journey to Venice, which starts in the cemetery. And it's a journey which becomes, of course, highly metaphorical. It's a journey into experience and a journey out of life. From Munich, the journey will proceed first to the island of Pula, as I told you, and then it will go on to Venice. But on that journey to Venice, he meets the second of the disfigured figures. And the second of these figures is an old rake on the boat who's gone with a family of a group of young men. And he's trying to look young. He's doing the worst he can. And he does what Aschenbach himself does at the end. He makes himself up. He dyes his hair. Is there anything worse than that feeling that somebody is desperately trying to retain youth, and if only they would let themselves be the age they are, they'd look younger? One of the party, extract 6, is in a dandified buff suit. So this is the text. A rakish Panama with a coloured scarf and a red cravat was loudest of the loud. He outcrowed all the rest. Aschenbach's eyes dwelt on him, and he was shocked to see that the apparent youth was no youth at all. He was an old man, beyond doubt, with wrinkles and crow's feet round the eyes and mouth. The dull carmine of the cheeks was rouge, the brown hair a wig. His neck was shrunken and sinewy. His turned-up moustaches and small imperial were dyed, and the unbroken row of yellow teeth he showed when he laughed were but too obviously a cheapish false set. He wore a seal ring on each finger, but the hands were those of an old man. Aschenbach was moved to shudder as he watched the creature and his association with the rest of the group. Could they not see he was old? And of course, it's deeply ironic, because it's what's going to happen to Aschenbach himself in the end, who desperately wanting to attract the attention of the young boy, makes the terrible mistake of allowing the barber to dye his hair, to put makeup on. Terrible part of the film. And then follows that extraordinary, dreamlike, trance-like ride in the gondola to the hotel itself, in which this vast expanse of sea represents the unknown that he's venturing into, no doubt, but also, of course, the journey from the station, from Venice itself to the Lido. And however sensible the gondola is in his talk, he says, well, you can't go by the Vaporetto because you can't take your luggage on it. But he's not reassured. And it's beautifully done, of course. But you can imagine the increased sense of menace being taken where you don't want to go, by somebody you didn't ask to do it. He's out of control again, isn't he? I won't describe the gondola to you, although he is, again, a rather threatening figure. I wasn't able to establish whether he had red hair or not, but I think you can assume under the cap he did. There are hints here, then, which will be developed later, of links to classical mythology, that idea of being rowed across the river Styx to Hades will be reinforced later by all sorts of references to classical mythology. This journey into uncharted waters in a black coffin-like boat. But Aschenbach, despite his apprehensions, arrives safely at the Lido. And once he's installed in his luxurious hotel and looks out of the window, he's restored by the sight of the sea. And of course, this is a book full of symbols. It would have to be 79 pages long and pack such a punch, wouldn't it? And the sea becomes something that both consoles and again threatens. He's at the very edge, the margins with this sea. It's a wonderful passage. How full and sending long, low waves with rhythmic beat upon the sand. I won't read it, but extract 8. The perverse, the illicit, the absurd notions which enter the solitary's mind on such occasions. So the sea invites illicit thoughts, thoughts of freedom and sex, as Freud would tell us, wouldn't he? All that water. But he also is consoled by the sight of the sea. There's also a reference here to one of the people who was behind the writing of this, probably, the poet Platon, P-L-A-T-E-N. August von Platen Hallamunder, 1796 to 1835, who died from cholera. So you're getting these little hints all the way along of the possible end, the probable end of our hero, and who had written a series of sonnets on Venice. I actually read them. I thought, oh, I'm going to follow up on this poet, because as soon as he sees the sea and he's in the gondola, he thinks of that poet who wrote those Venetian sonnets. And I'll tell you a little bit later about another couple of inspirations. Now, his first glimpse of Tadzio shortly afterwards, let's have a very attractive Tadzio, the attractive one, we'll have the attractive one. Shortly afterwards turns his ordered world upside down. The result, man may be implying, of long, hard years of repression. I won't read it all to you because it's a long quote, but I will just read a little bit of extract 9, in which he has very cleverly, man, contrasted the girls, the 3 girls, with their governess, Polish, sisters of Tadzio, and their severity of dress with Tadzio, who is obviously adored and spoilt by his mother. Round a wicker table next to him was gathered a group of young folk in charge of a governess or companion. 3 young girls, perhaps 15 to 17 years old, and a long-haired boy of about 14. Aschenbach noticed with astonishment the lad's perfect beauty. His face recalled the noblest moment of Greek sculpture, pale with a sweet reserve, with clustering honey-coloured ringlets, the brow and nose descending in one line, the winning mouth, the expression of pure and godlike serenity. Yet with all this chaste perfection of form, it was of such unique personal charm that the observer thought he had never seen, either in nature or art, anything so utterly happy and consummate. Now, this is important, because one of the central arguments of the book that circles round the Apollonian and Dionysiac will be Plato's symposium that Socrates has with a young man, Festus, I think his name is, and he says to him, the way to beauty is often, the way to art is often through beauty. And this is the argument, of course, that is so cleverly put into the musician and his young disciple in the film, because what he's saying is, unless you have tasted that passion, unless you have tasted that wildness, you cannot create the work of art. It's cold, it's lacking in something, yes, it's beautifully organized, but there's something lacking. And I see this story myself, and I'm not the only one, and I certainly saw it this way even before I read somebody far more authoritative, but I think most people who have read it many times see it as his gradual climb to the height of appreciation of beauty, away from that terrible control that he's been exercising, and then his descent as it takes hold of him and a kind of madness comes on him, his descent again into the opposite camp, so that neither extreme is what is going to create that tremendous work of art. It's that balance in the middle. There's one moment in the middle where he writes one page of perfect prose, and from then on it's downhill all the way, you might say. But it's a very interesting way of putting it, this old man with his great passion for the young man. There is a reference in the passage I've just read you to a Greek sculpture of Spinario, S-P-I-N-A-R-I-O, and those of you who know your Greek references very well will know who that is. I didn't, so I'm going to tell you who it is. A bronze statue of Greco-Roman Hellenistic times of a beautiful boy withdrawing a fawn from his foot. And it's the first of many classical allusions. Aschenbach thinks of Tadzio constantly in terms of beautiful Greek boys. He compares him to Clytus, Cephalus, Orion, Phaedrus. Oh, it was the dialogue with Phaedrus I was trying to think of. Phaedrus, Hyacinth, and Narcissus. Well, even I recognize Hyacinth and Narcissus, and many others. The majority of them all beautiful young boys loved by the gods. All, I think, having tragic connotations. None of those stories really, I think I might say, end terribly well. So hints, again, are being given as to how this will end. And, I mean, there's so many. You could write a book on it. I won't. Man's method, he tells us, is to provide myth plus psychology. And I think that's what's so brilliant about it. It's a kind of imaginative reconstruction, but it's also a psychological insight into what happens when an old man falls hopelessly. Do you remember that point where he says, in the book and in the film, although in different places in each, he leans against the door and he says, I love you. I love you. And he feels completely desperate. What I was after, man said, was an equilibrium of sensuality and morality, such as I found perfected in Goethe's elective affinities, which I read 5 times while working on Death in Venice. Passion, and this is the bit I wanted you to remember, passion as confusion and as a stripping of dignity. Passion as confusion and as a stripping of dignity was really the subject of my tale. It's an interesting way of looking, and a helpful way, I think, of looking at. There's plenty of psychology. I mean, when you think of the way in which he shows you the disintegration, the way in which he shows you his rationalizations, and the way in which he cannot resist in the end because he has been too repressed, and the repression bursts out in this mad behavior. And he is, I think, in all this trying to tell us about the need for balance of a certain kind in art. Not the control, but the balance that he's seeking. The effect of Tadzio's extreme youth and beauty on Aschenbach is to make Aschenbach very conscious of his age, as I've mentioned. Do you know how old he is? About 55? I think you'll probably sympathize with me when I say I didn't think that was really terribly old. But there are references to his grey hair and his weary face. And you see, he's face to face with this wonderful young boy, this living figure, I'm quoting, virginally pure and austere, with dripping locks, beautiful as a tender young god emerging from the depths of the sea and sky. I mean, it would make anybody feel old, wouldn't it? Even if he were only 20. The weather, too, increases his sense of oppression. It's very well done, the weather, in here, because when he arrives, it's not very good, and the Scirocco is building up. And he decides, finally, he is going to go because of it. It's a menace, the Scirocco. It's a kind of sense of brooding which hangs over the pages from the first. Extract 10, there was a hateful sultriness in the narrow streets. The air was so heavy that all the manifold smells wafted out of houses, shops and cook shops, smells of oil, perfumery and so forth, hung low like exhalations, not dissipating. Cigarette smoke seemed to stand in the air. It drifted so slowly away. Today, the crowd in these narrow lanes oppressed the stroller instead of diverting him. The longer he walked, the more was he in tortures under a state which is the product of sea air and the Scirocco, and which excites and enervates at once. He perspired painfully, his eyes rebelled, his chest was heavy, he felt feverish, the blood throbbed in his temples. He fled from the huddled narrow streets of the commercial city, crossed many bridges, and came into the poor quarter of Venice. beggars waylaid him. The canals sickened him with their evil exhalation. He reached a quiet square, one of those that exist in the city's heart, forsaken of God and man. Tremendous build-up, isn't it, to what is going to be, finally, his own catching of the cholera. As a result, he announces his plans to leave, and you know the plot, but just to remind you how well it's done, because he plans to leave, but he doesn't want to leave, because, of course, he's already infatuated with Tadzio, but he decides to go. So he goes to the station, and when he gets there, the man is tremendously apologetic and says, "I'm awfully sorry, but your trunk has been forwarded to the wrong place." And the relief, and it's not just in the film that you see the relief, by the way. In the book, it's even more explicitly spelled out. This joy, a reckless joy, man writes, a deep, incredible mirthfulness shook him almost as with a spasm. Because, of course, now he can stay. He's got an excuse. My luggage has gone. What is this? You know, I'm going back to the hotel, and he's so pleased with himself. And then again, the weather, in keeping with all this, changes again, and the sun comes up. Not any old sun. Now daily, extract 12, the naked god with cheeks aflame drove his 4 far-breathing steeds through heaven's spaces, and with him streamed the strong east wind that fluttered his yellow locks. So this is the Greek god, the sun god, driving his chariot across the sky. And Aschenbach can now stay in Venice, spending his days on the beach, a forlorn old man, gazing at the object of his youthful adoration, and can see only perfect, prepubescent beauty. And it's at this point, understandably, that all those long repressed passions burst forth. He's on holiday, he's not writing, and he's there, feeding his eyes daily. The link between his obsession and his work is made because he's actually looking at the Tadzio and saying, this is a work of art. He's beginning to understand what Plato is telling Phaedrus in the dialogue, that sometimes beauty itself will lead you to a knowledge of a certain kind of art, and that those who haven't tasted it perhaps are limited in what they can do. What discipline, what precision of thought were expressed by the tense youthful perfection of his form. It's a long passage about that. So that when the date he intends to leave comes, he doesn't go. He doesn't end his holiday, he ignores it. He knows because of, again, of smell, what he's smelling, this strange smell in the air, the disinfecting of the city. And it's a wonderful metaphor, isn't it? A wonderful symbol. The cholera is a symbol for all that is going wrong with Aschenbach himself. It's gradually taking him over. It's gradually infecting him. And he himself sees it as a kind of metaphor for what is happening to him. And, of course, made worse by the fact that he now imagines that Tadzio is returning his affection. He believes that Tadzio has returned his look, and it is referred to, this particular moment, as a fatal gift, which, of course, is highly ambiguous. The gift is that he will get cholera. The gift of the smile means that he will stay. Staying means that he will get cholera, particularly when in despair he eats the infected strawberries. Talk about the Garden of Eden and the apples. And I don't know whether you noticed, but early on in the story, he shows his fondness for strawberries by just sort of nibbling a few on the beach. He doesn't eat very much, but he eats the strawberries, and later on, knowing, it's almost as though he wills his death, because later on he knows that he shouldn't eat. In the film, of course, they have to spell it out, you know. Oh, you don't eat the fresh fruit, one of the Americans said. But in the film, later on, in the cholera-infected city, he takes the strawberries and he eats them again, and in a sense signs his own death warrant. Right on cue, then, as though man wants us to see this as a fatal gift, the cholera comes. It's now that the final disfigured figure or grotesque appears, that musician who arrives at Aschenbach's hotel. And I think it's wonderful that he's singing the laughing song, don't you? Anything but. And of course, you are led to believe in the text that the musician himself probably has cholera, that he himself is giving off this rather awful odour. The performer below, extract 15, presently began a solo with guitar accompaniment, a street song in several stanzas. Just then the rage all over Italy. He delivered it in a striking and dramatic recitative, and his company joined in the refrain. He was a man of slight build, with a thin, undernourished face. His shabby felt hat rested on the back of his neck, a great mop of red hair sticking out in front, and he stood there on the gravel in advance of his troop, in an impudent, swaggering posture, twanging the strings of his instrument and flinging a witty and rollicking recitative up to the terrace, while the veins on his forehead swelled with the violence of his effort. And then it goes on a bit later. The words of his song were trivial and silly, but on his lips, accompanied with gestures of head, hands, arms, and body, with leers and winks, and the loose play of the tongue in the corner of his mouth, they took on meaning, an equivocal meaning, yet vaguely offensive. He wore a white sports shirt, suit of ordinary clothes, and a strikingly large and naked-looking Adam's apple rose straight out of the collar, open collar. From that pale, snub-nosed face, it was hard to judge of his age. Vice sat on it, was furrowed with grimacing, and two deep wrinkles of defiance and self-will, almost of desperation, stood oddly between the red brows above the grinning, mobile mouth. But what more than all drew upon him the profound scrutiny of our solitary watcher was that this suspicious figure seemed to carry with it its own suspicious odour. It really is quite creepy, this story. Just as well it's so short, isn't it? But it's not until Aschenbach visits an English travel agent, I'm glad to report. Only the English tell you the truth, you see. That he's told the truth and advised to leave at once. Gripped by his passion, however, as I've mentioned, he can't bring himself to leave, or, and this is where you feel that he has deteriorated very badly, he cannot bring himself to tell the Polish family of the threat to them, of the threat to the son whom he adores, the children, and the governess. And so he imagines it in his head, he imagines he's going to do it, but when it comes to it, he can't do it. He can't send away the one thing that has given his meaning, his life meaning at that point. And so he doesn't tell them. Fortunately, they leave anyway. But it's interesting, isn't it, the way in which all this is sort of showing you a moral struggle, but not a very hard one. So where the moral fable is, I don't know. And that night, he has a hideous dream, full of lust. It's a wonderful dream. We can't indulge in all of it, just a bit of it, extract 16, about just over halfway from the wooded heights, from among the tree trunks and crumbling moss-covered rocks, a troop came tumbling and raging down a whirling rout of men and animals, and overflowed the hillside with flames and human forms, with clamour and the reeling dance. The females stumbled over the long, hairy pelts that dangled from their girdles. With heads flung back, they uttered loud, hoarse cries and shook their tambourines high in air, brandished naked daggers or torches, vomiting trails of sparks. They shrieked, holding their breasts in both hands, coiling snakes with quivering tongues they clutched about their waists, horned and hairy males girt about, well, where did he get all this from? You do wonder, don't you? I mean, I've never had quite such a vivid dream. And the next day, with newly dyed hair and makeup, and much of the grotesque himself as the aging fop who horrified him on the boat. He appears, and he follows Tadzio and his family once again round the streets of Venice. Although, as his wife said in that earlier extract, she said he didn't actually, I should read you that bit because it's quite interesting. He didn't actually follow the boy, but she implies that he would have done if he could have. He didn't pursue him through all of Venice, that's Tadzio. That he didn't do, but the boy did fascinate him. And he thought of him often. I still remember, the wife says, I still remember that my uncle, Privy Councillor Friedberg, a famous professor of canon law in Leipzig, was outraged. What a story. And a married man with a family. So you see, it was actually quite near to life. And I think probably what is particularly interesting is his own report when he says, himself, Mann says, he says, they asked him, they said, what was invented in Death in Venice? And he said, nothing in Death in Venice is invented. The traveller, and I'm quoting him, the traveller by the North Cemetery in Munich, the gloomy boat from Pula, the aged fop, the dubious gondolier, Tadzio and his family, the departure prevented by a mix-up over luggage, the cholera, the honest clerk in the travel agency, the malevolent street singer, or whatever else you might care to mention. Everything was given. So it all came to him, apparently, and really only needed to be fitted in, proving in the most astonishing manner how it could be interpreted within my composition. Now, can this be true? I mean, can you imagine Mann himself? I'll tell you just a tiny bit about him. But Mann himself, born in 1875, died in 1955, was so respectable in his lifetime. I mean, he married at a reasonable age. He had 6 children. His brother was a well-known writer. He was a well-known writer. 3 of his children, Erika, Klaus, and Golo, were also became important German writers. His father had owned a big family business in a Hanseatic port of Lübeck, and he was due to take it over, well, after his older brother. But the father died when he was 16, and he went off instead to Munich, and you can see the contrast between the controlled German rigid system and the Munich of Bavaria, which is very different, and I think that's possibly one of the seeds of the story. His mother, however, was she was not German. She was what was she? Oh, Brazilian, of German and Portuguese origin. So he had a rather mixed heritage. When he got to Munich, he instantly stopped studying the sciences and started studying the history of art, the classics, etc. Because he now no longer, the family firm went bust, he no longer was needed in the family business. And he lived in Munich from 1891 to 1933, when you remember Munich was in an uproar over Hitler, and he was forced to leave Germany because, not because he was Jewish, but because he thought Hitler was behaving outrageously. And so he fled to Germany. And in 1939, no, he fled to Switzerland, and then in 1939 he moved to the USA, returning to Switzerland in 1952 and dying there 3 years later. Now, in 1905, he married, and you know, his wife seemed to be sort of okay with him. I mean, there certainly wasn't a bad marriage. Katja Pringsheim, the daughter of a wealthy Jewish but secular industrialist. They had 6 children and an apparently successful marriage. So where does it come from? And I want to end with far the juiciest part of this lecture by telling you about his homosexual secret life. His diaries, I'm only partially joking, Mann's diaries, unsealed only in 1975, 20 years after his death, show that his sexuality was not at all straightforward. Anthony Heilbut's biography, Thomas Mann, Eros and Literature, in 1997, uncovered the centrality of his sexuality to his work, particularly in Death in Venice. I never believe that art can be explained wholly in terms of your sexuality, but it is important, as I knew when I was studying the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who was a homosexual. In particular, he traced his passion, aged 24, for the violinist. Now you see where the Visconti got his idea. The violinist Paul Ehrenberg, the central experience of my heart, he called it. And then he describes his escape into marriage, because he didn't want to go down that route. It wasn't respectable, it was illegal, he didn't want it. But his infatuation at the age of 53 with the 17-year-old Klaus Heusser, it's almost as though he's fulfilling what he wrote in 1911, isn't it? The age of 53. And then at 75. So he was 53 and the young man, Heusser, was 17. And then at 75, Heilbut tells you of the way in which Mann took a liking to a young waiter in a Zurich hotel, which was immortalized in his later work, Felix Krull. The diaries, Heilbut assures us, are drenched with yearning for him. There is, however, no evidence that any of these affairs were physical, though Death in Venice suggests that there was a good deal of longing for it. And we must be careful not to exaggerate. I mean, I can't say to you this is something that he would have liked. This is wish fulfillment. But we do know that he did struggle with his sexuality, and all his life he had that struggle. And he really had seen the boy, and he had remembered the boy. We must also remember, of course, that Mann was only 36 when he wrote it, so it can't possibly be autobiographical in that sense. But it is an interesting aspect, isn't it? Whatever he felt, he did not behave recklessly. He did not follow, as his wife testified, he did not follow the young man round Venice, nor did he die on the beach alone. And that last passage where he dies on the beach alone, I was always intrigued by that. Why was there an abandoned camera lying on the beach? You know, when people are trying to understand what these obscure expressionist films are about, and they say, what was the significance of grandfather's wooden leg in the corner, or something like that. But when he dies, it's almost as though he, who is the observer, all the way through, isn't he? All the way through, he is watching, he is observing, he is outside looking in, and then he becomes involved, he enters into it, and it brings about his death. And it's as though that camera is the only thing left recording his death, because there's nobody else who will tell us about the death. It's not a very satisfactory explanation, but if anybody has a better one, come and tell me and I'll tell you all tomorrow. Thank you very much indeed. And don't go home and slit your throats.